Department of Philosophy at Carnegie Mellon University. He's very well known for his seminal work on developing causal search algorithms and proving conditions under which it is possible to infer causal relationships from observational data. He's written a wonderful book on causation, prediction, and search, and today he's going to tell us about recent methodological advances in automated causal discovery. Very much looking forward to your talk.
Thank you. First of all, thank you for inviting me. It's been a very informative day. What I'd like to talk about is sort of why automated causal inference is becoming increasingly important, what the major obstacles to automated causal inference are, and sort of some things about what obstacles have been overcome and what obstacles remain. So one common discovery context is that we have a lot of variables, and it may be a mixture of discrete and continuous variables. There's not a lot known about how the variables are related, although you might know time order. And you've got some observational data, and maybe you have some experimental data, and you possibly have a little bit of background knowledge. And what you would like to do is, first of all, gain insight into the process which generated that data. And second of all, what you would like to do is to predict the effects of doing an experimental intervention on this system. And you might be interested in getting point estimates. You might be interested in getting bounds. You might be interested in locating the variables which have the largest effect upon a particular variable. So I'm going to take those to be the goals, and that's really what's making it causal in this case. It's being able to predict the effects of interventions rather than merely making inferences about the system as it currently exists. So let me give you an example of the kind of system I would be talking about. And this is from Steckhoven et al. So the problem is that you have a plant, and you're interested in trying to figure out which genes are the causes of how long it takes this plant to flower. So you have gene expression profile, and in this case they had 21,326 genes, and their sample size was 47. So I'm not going to say what they did exactly, although it's an extension of various things I'm going to talk about today. But they applied some automated causal inference algorithms. They made a lot of assumptions, all of which were quite certainly wrong. They assumed it was Gaussian, and it wasn't. They assumed there's no feedback in the genetic regulatory system, but there is. They assumed that there were no unmeasured confounders. They assumed there's no selection bias. Nevertheless, despite the fact that all of these assumptions are wrong, they got some useful results out. So they looked at what they estimated were the 20 most important genes for affecting the time to flowering. And it turned out that of the top 20, a number of them had been previously known as causes of time to flowering. There were 14 left where they could A, hadn't been previously known, and B, they could mutate it to knock the gene out. And so when they did that, 5 of the mutants died. There were 9 that were left. Whoops. This thing always takes over for me and just starts going. It's bored with this part, so next. Among the 9 that were left, they found 4 that had a significant effect on the time to flowering. So those are pretty good results. I mean, they're useful results. So this is just intended to illustrate this is the kind of problem that we're interested in. We had a very large number of variables. We really didn't know much about the system. We had to make a lot of assumptions that were wrong, but nevertheless, we could get some useful information out about the system. Okay. So I should say that when I started doing this in the 80s, that what you often found was that the number of variables that you were dealing with was relatively small. So there were lots and lots of data sets with 10 variables and 5 variables and 12 variables. And at that time, you could sort of think, I don't actually need automated causal inference. I can use some background knowledge to limit the search. I can sort of informally by hand come up with a model, test it, see if it fails, do a couple of modifications to the model, and then keep going until I found one that passed some test. All of that was done informally and behind the scenes. Nobody would say how they came up with the model. They would just say, here's the model. But I think what's clear now is that there's been this huge explosion in our data gathering capabilities, so that it's not uncommon to find 20,000 variables, or if you're dealing with SNPs, 1 million variables, or if you're dealing with fMRI data, 100,000 variables. So there's sort of no longer any possibility of being able to say, well, I can just sort of do this by hand and use some knowledge about what I have and do a couple of tests and try to improve the model. Given what we're interested in, such as reconstructing genetic regulatory networks or finding which SNPs cause which disease, or how brain signaling and how signals in the brain are passed, if it's not going to be with automated methods, then it's got to be something like I'm going to be able to have to do the experiments. But the number of experiments that you would need to do is staggering in the case of a genetic regulatory network. So not only might you have to manipulate individual genes, but you might have to start manipulating pairs of genes if you're trying to see interactive effects, or triples of genes. So the number of possible experiments that would have to be done is just exploding beyond anything we know how to do now. So that kind of leaves us with, if we hope to be able to solve these problems, we need to be able to take some combination of background knowledge, observational data, and limited experimental data and draw further conclusions from it. Now, the particular kinds of causal problems that we're dealing with, they share a lot of features with sort of ordinary probabilistic problems. That is, you may be interested in classification of digits, for example, or you may be interested in some kind of regression problem where you're trying to predict the value of one variable from more easily measured variables. But despite the fact that they share a lot in common, they have a number of rather key differences. So again, they're sort of answering different questions. The causal model is answering questions about about the effects of interventions on a system, whereas the probabilistic model is not answering that question. They have different standards of success. So the causal model succeeds when basically it makes the right intervention predictions, whereas the probabilistic model has succeeded when it successfully represents the probability distribution among the unmanipulated system. They make somewhat different assumptions, and I'm going to get to those assumptions soon. And there's different problems in sort of testing the models, and there's different problems in search, and there's a different role that simplicity assumptions play. So I'm going to return to those in a little bit. So I've just listed here a number of things why this is going to be a very hard problem, and that's because the search space is absolutely huge. If we represent the causal model with directed graphs, then the number of graphs is growing super exponentially with the number of variables. So by the time you get to like 20 or 30 variables, it's already like equal to the number of elementary particles in the universe. By the time you get to 1 million variables, well, you can figure that out. There are hidden variables, there's missing data, there's time series, there's measurement error, there's the fact that your sample is not random, there are sort of weird distributions that arise because of complicated causal processes, there's feedback, and there's something called almost unfaithful distributions, which I will get to. So all of these are extremely difficult problems. Some of them there are partial answers to. There's typically a trade-off in this research between sort of how I can drop some of the assumptions, and how many variables I can handle, how fast it will run, and B, how informative my output is. So I'm going to illustrate this with a somewhat old and very simple study, which had to do with the question of what caused children to plan to go to college. And they measured 5 variables: sex, IQ, college plans, parental encouragement, and socioeconomic status. And this is simply an illustration of a model of college plans. And here it would be, this was actually taken in the 60s. So at the time, the ratio of women to men in college was actually less than 1. Now, of course, it's much greater than 1. So I think this data set is probably not relevant anymore. But basically, we put in a directed edge from socioeconomic status to college plans, and that simply means if I were to experimentally manipulate socioeconomic status and hold these other variables fixed, then I would get some change in college plans. And the standard of success, of course, if I'm doing a probabilistic model where I take my probability model to be just a set of probability distributions, is if I'm interested in classification, I'm interested in accuracy, et cetera. If I'm interested in, or I could be interested in the closeness of the predicted distribution to the actual distribution. But if I have a causal model, then I'm interested in the closeness of the manipulated distribution to the actual manipulated distribution. And the problem that raises is that when I want to test things, it's relatively easy with respect to the probabilistic model because I can, for instance, train my methods on some data and hold out other data and then just check whether my predicted distribution matches the distribution on the held out data. But that's exactly what I can't do with the causal model. In order to check my answer, I really need to be able to do the manipulation. But in many cases, that's either impossible or too expensive to do. So I think this has been kind of a major obstacle to developing methods, just because what people tend to do in place of testing it against the manipulations is that they tend to do it, test it using simulations. And the simulations typically are nicer than real data. Anything is nicer than real data. So basically, you don't have that good a sense of how well you're doing. So I think it would be enormously beneficial to this whole area of research if there was some way of sort of saying, here are the 20 experiments I would like you to do, and then we would kind of get a systematic view of how well you're doing, as opposed to, well, you know, there are a couple of success stories, but then of course we don't know how many of the failure stories we didn't hear about. So let me give you the standard picture of how this setup works. So I'm going to give you the vanilla picture and then talk about what's wrong with the vanilla picture and ways that we might try and fix the vanilla picture. So in the vanilla picture, we start off with the idea that there's this thing called causal sufficiency, which is just that a set of variables is causally sufficient when every cause of any pair of variables in the set is also in the set. So parental encouragement in college plans is not causally sufficient because socioeconomic status is a cause of both members of the set, but it's not in the set. But on the other hand, if this were the correct causal graph, then, for instance, the set socioeconomic status, sex, IQ, parental encouragement, and college plans would be causally sufficient. Now, the first fundamental assumption that is typically made is a Markov assumption, and that is that, for instance, college plans is independent of variables that are neither its direct causes nor its effects, and in this graph that would be sex, conditional on its direct causes, parental encouragement, socioeconomic status, and IQ. And the causal Markov assumption just applies that to every variable. So it's a kind of extension of the usual Markov assumption whereby the recent past screens off the more distant past. But it also applies to sort of latent variable cases where if I have a latent common cause of two variables, then the latent common cause screens off the two variables from each other. So if I have that causal Markov assumption, it turns out that there are a bunch of other conditional independence relations that are entailed by satisfying that causal Markov assumption. And they're entailed for all values of the parameters. It doesn't matter how you parameterize this graph, you'll get this set of conditional independence relations out. So it's important to note, however, that just because a conditional independence is not entailed for all values of the parameters doesn't mean that it doesn't hold for some values of the parameters. I can often choose exactly the right parameter values in such a way that I get out some conditional independence which is not entailed. So how do I use the causal Markov assumption in search? In search. Okay. The idea is that I can do tests of conditional independence of my data. So if this is the true causal model, I would, and I note that in the population there's a conditional dependence, that entails that certain causal relationships exist. So for instance, if I took that edge out and I was evaluating that model, then it would entail that sex and parental encouragement are independent. But if I find that they're not independent when I do the test, I'm sorry, not sex, socioeconomic status and parental encouragement are independent, then if I did a test and found out they were dependent, then I could eliminate that model as not being a good model. So I'm going to spend a lot of time on the causal faithfulness assumption because it's a much more dubious assumption. And the causal faithfulness assumption sort of goes the other way. It's an attempt to say that from independencies, I can conclude that certain causal relations don't exist. So in this case, for instance, the causal faithfulness assumption would say something like, college plans is dependent on parental encouragement because it's not entailed to be independent. That is, there are ways in which I could possibly choose the parameters to make them independent, but it's not independent for all values of the parameters. So that's basically all this says, which is you can apply that, again, to every variable. So how would I apply that in practice? Well, suppose I was considering this model, and in this model, I've done two things to the model. I've reversed this edge, and I've hang on a second. Yeah, okay. I've reversed this edge, and I've added this edge. And in this case, this is a model in which I could, for instance, force sex and parental encouragement to be independent of each other by carefully. No. Let me do that again. If I got them right. I could, let's see. Well, if I add that edge, then I'm basically going to have that sex and socioeconomic status could be made independent of each other by choosing the right values of the parameters, but it would not be entailed to be independent. So unlike the true model where it's entailed to be independent, this would be a case where I could unfaithfully get that independence out. This is a more complex model than the true model because I have this extra edge. So it actually represents a larger set of models. And basically, the faithfulness assumption is a kind of simplicity assumption, which says that you should prefer models which entail conditional independencies which hold in the population, rather than models in which you might be able to choose parameters which get that out, but which don't entail it. So it's a kind of simplicity assumption. And then let me just say, so we've looked at we've eliminated models that had too few edges. We've eliminated models that had too many edges. There are some models that we can't eliminate. For instance, this model simply reverses one edge, the edge between socioeconomic status and IQ, and it actually entails exactly the same set of distributions in the Gaussian or the multinomial case as the true causal model. So I can't eliminate this model by anything I've assumed so far, or indeed if it's Gaussian or multinomial, there's nothing in the data which is going to tell me which one of those is correct. So I'm going to be stuck with outputting it was either this model or the model with the edge reversed. And that's what the algorithms do. When they output, instead of individual graphs, they output what are these Markov equivalent graphs, the graphs that entail the exact same set of conditional independencies. So the problem with this, of course, is, and this can be represented by a pattern, and a pattern simply everywhere, if everybody in the Markov equivalence class has the same direction, it outputs that direction, and if somebody in the Markov equivalence class has different directions, then it outputs an undirected edge. So what can I do with this? Well, what I can do with this is basically, there are a number of different things I can do. I can look at this output of the Markov equivalence class, and I can tell that some things wouldn't be changed under certain manipulations. So for instance, if I manipulate IQ, then the probability of parental encouragement given socioeconomic status and IQ would remain the same for everybody in that Markov equivalence class. If I go to the third line, then what it says is actually the probability of college plans given parental encouragement would change if I manipulated parental encouragement, but I can figure out what it would be because all of these are observational terms, so it's just some algebraic combination of those. For the cases where I can't identify them because they actually disagree, so for instance, does socioeconomic status, what is the probability of IQ if I manipulate socioeconomic status? In order to answer that, I'd have to know which way the edge went. Since I don't know which way the edge went, the only thing I could do is try both values. So I could say it's one of these two values, but I don't know which one it is. So it's actually computationally difficult to do that, but Marlowe-Schmatwie's figured out an algorithm by which you can calculate these bounds by basically generating quickly all of the possible different values that you could get from members of this Markov equivalence class. Okay, so that's what I could do if I had the Markov equivalence class. And so far I'm assuming there's no latent variables and there's no selection bias. However, we can drop those assumptions later. So basically, what you can do is to have a search which looks for the graph that most closely, in some sense, entails the conditional independence relations found to hold in the sample. So you're going to do a bunch of conditional independence tests, and you're going to look for the model which entails those conditional independencies that you think hold. One negative feature of this is it doesn't allow you to compare how good different models are. It just outputs a model, which is not very satisfactory because it's not telling you how good that model is, or how much better it is than some other model. And because of the size of the number of tests that you would have to do, it's important that you actually avoid doing all of those tests. Otherwise, you're limited to a very small set of variables. So some of the advantages of doing a constraint-based search are that you can trade off informativeness versus speed. So if you have less time, then you can get output which gives you less identifiable effects, but of the ones that it identifies will still be correct. It can be applied to any distributions where you can do conditional independence tests, and have been developed recently a number of tests which are, at least theoretically, quite general, non-parametric tests, although they are often slow and require large sample sizes. And it can easily be extended to work with hidden variables and selection bias. So, and again, it would simply, instead of outputting a Markov equivalence class over the full set of variables, it would output a kind of Markov equivalence class over the set of measured variables, conditional on the variables that you have conditioned on. So faithfulness can actually fail in a number of different ways. It can fail when you have some cases of determinism. So if you have A causes B causes C, but A equals B equals C, you will actually get extra conditional independence relations that hold even though they're not entailed by the graphical structure. They're entailed by the graphical structure plus the fact that these three variables are equal. You can get failures of faithfulness when paths cancel each other. So if A causes B causes C and A causes C, and it turns out that the path from A to B to C is positive and the path from A to C is negative, if they exactly cancel each other, then you'll get some extra conditional independence relations. And in the case of discrete variables, for instance, you can just get, when you basically are marginalizing out variables, which is a kind of averaging, you can get some extra conditional independence constraints that just happen for the particular values of the parameters. So this is a picture I stole from Carolyn It basically shows if I have 3 random variables and a complete graph among the 3 variables and the system is Gaussian, we can look at the space of parameters and ask which values of the parameters would lead to some extra conditional independence relation not entailed by the graph. So we could get that the covariance of x1 and x3 is 0, and then this is the space of parameters that would lead to that. And similarly, I could get that x1 and x2 are independent given x3, and the space would look like that. And then I would similarly for all the other possible covariances. And then this is a picture of all the surfaces in the space of parameters, which would lead to the final, which would lead to violations of faithfulness. So the good news, which is only temporary, is that the Lebesgue measure of those surfaces is 0. So I can, so the Lebesgue measure, so in the space of the set of parameters that lead to violations of faithfulness is 0. So you could then say, well, I'm not in such bad shape. I'll just ignore the cases where it could happen and assume it doesn't happen. And if I do that, then I can say that in the large sample limit, I'll eventually get the right Markov equivalence class. It'll eventually be okay. I can get point estimates of some of the causal strengths, the ones that don't have, for instance, I can't get the ones where there's undirected edges between them, but I can get other ones. And I can get non-trivial bounds of causal strength. And all of that will work. And I can even drop the assumption that there are no unmeasured confounders. And I can drop the assumption that there's no selection bias. And I can basically run the whole story. It's more complicated, but I can basically run the whole story again. Now, in this picture of what's going on, faithfulness is really playing 3 distinct roles. It's basically reducing the underdetermination because it's saying, if you see this, you prefer it to that. Because this one says A is independent of B and entails it. This one just allows A to be independent of B. So it says, prefer this one to this one. So you're getting less underdetermination. You're also getting computationally efficient. Because basically, what it's saying is, if I have a graph, at some stage I've determined that A and C are adjacent and C and B are adjacent, and A is independent of B, then I don't even need to check whether A is independent of B conditional on C. Faithfulness will guarantee that I don't need to worry about that. And it also is getting me statistical efficiency, because basically it's telling me that I don't have to ever look at whether A is independent of B conditional on some subset of 100 variables. I only have to look at whether it's independent of B conditional on a few variables, namely its parents. So assuming that the graph is not really dense, what that means is I get also statistical efficiency. So, so the problem with this is that is several-fold. First of all, you don't actually need full causal faithfulness to run this story. You can weaken it in a number of ways. And one way in which you can weaken it is basically to say, I don't need to care whether every conditional independence that is not entailed doesn't hold. I only need to care about some subset of them. So, so we have revised the algorithms so that we have weakened the assumption that you need. Now, there's some cost to that, and again, the cost typically comes out in that things are a little bit slower and that they require more, or rather you get more unidentifiable quantities in the answer. So there's been research of that kind. But the bigger worry is that Caroline has done this great research on is in practice, of course, you don't have to be on the surface to fool the algorithm. The algorithm is going to do some kind of statistical test. So since the algorithm is doing some kind of statistical test, if you're close to that surface, you're going to mistakenly believe that even though the correlation is not zero, if it's close enough to zero, your algorithm will assume that it's zero and then make mistakes anyway. So that won't happen in the limit, of course, but on real data it'll happen. It can happen a lot. And moreover, because of the sheer number of conditional independencies that you're looking at, and because as you increase the size of the conditioning set, you're getting more and more complicated polynomials. That means, and because there's a nonlinear relationship between your parameters and your correlations, that means that the volume of the parameter space filled by things which are close to being unfaithful is going to be quite large. Now, that's not quite as bad as it sounds for the following reason. Not every mistake that you make in this actually necessarily leads to a mistake in the output. Nevertheless, it's going to be the case, this shows up in practice. In practice, you're not ever going to find in your sample, if you have a reasonable number of variables, that even if you generate it from a known graph, that your sample looks like it's faithful to that graph. So there's a number of different approaches that people have taken to try to, so let me back up a step. Because of that almost unfaithfulness, that basically is that the faithfulness assumption by itself is not strong enough to get you the results that you really want. So it's not just that you want to get the correct answer in the limit. What you want is that at finite samples, you could at least bound the probability of having of errors in your Markov equivalence class. And because of those almost unfaithful distributions, it turns out that there isn't any algorithm which can do that if all you assume is Markov unfaithfulness. So that means that if you want to be able to achieve that, you've got to modify something. Now, there's a number of different things that you could do. One thing that you could do is try and find better algorithms which don't depend as much on faithfulness. You could strengthen the assumptions that you make. You could strengthen the data. And in terms of this system, what that would mean is that instead of only looking at conditional independence relations, I actually look at, I actually do something which looks beyond the conditional independence relations. And, or you could weaken the sense of success. So basically, all of these things have been tried. And let me just say a few things about what happens when you try these various ways of dealing with this problem. So one thing you can do is strengthen the assumption about faithfulness. And one way you can do that is, in effect, instead of saying, I assume that my distribution is faithful to the graph, well, let me put it the other way. Instead of assuming there's no unfaithfulness to the graph, I assume there's no almost unfaithfulness to the graph. So if I do that, that's basically saying, well, if a particular conditional independence is not entailed to be zero, then not only will I assume that it's not zero, I will assume it's greater than some fixed quantity lambda. So basically now I'm carving out areas around those surfaces of unfaithfulness and saying, I'm not going to allow the distribution in close. Or I'm going to assume that the distribution actually doesn't fall somewhere in that strip right near the surface of unfaithfulness. And if you do that, then you can get uniform, consistent, without much modification to the algorithms, you can actually get uniformly consistent algorithms which bound the probability of errors in your Markov equivalence class. And you can even allow the density of the graph and the number of variables in the graph to grow with the sample size as long as you control that rate of growth. The problem comes from sort of what Carolyn's analysis showed, which is that that assumption is going to be violated fairly often unless you make lambda extremely tiny. So that doesn't seem quite like the right assumption to make. Moreover, it has a very peculiar implication. If I have a very weak edge, then I will have a very weak correlation. And you're assuming that there aren't any such very weak correlations. So basically you're saying that there are certain edge strengths that can't exist. But you would think exactly the opposite. You would think there were lots of weak edge strengths. So it doesn't seem like a plausible assumption on that version either. So a second thing that we've tried to do is to have a version of faithfulness which, instead of saying that you can't get close to the surface of unfaithfulness, that you have to remain a certain fixed distance away from those zero correlations, is to say that what you're not allowed to do is get too close depending upon how strong the edge is. So if you have a strong edge, then it's saying we will assume that you're not getting real close to the surface of unfaithfulness. But if it's a weak edge, then it would say, well, it's okay to get really close to the surface of unfaithfulness. We would expect you to be close to the surface of unfaithfulness. So this allows for the possibility of very weak edges. So how close you're allowed to get to the surface of unfaithfulness depends upon how strong the edge is. Okay. So the other thing, now this does not get you uniform consistency in the sense, in the same sense that the lambda faithfulness gets you. It does, however, allow you to do the following. It allows you to weaken the sense of success in the following way. In the other case, the sense of success was either I got the right Markov equivalence class or I didn't. There was nothing about being close to the right Markov equivalence class. This allows you to say, well, if I leave out a weak edge, I was close to the correct Markov equivalence class. So if I allow you, so that allows you certain kinds of failures. Okay, it allows you under this sense of success. If you leave out a weak edge and you're close, then what you can say is I can bound the probability of errors beyond a certain size at a given sample. And if that's the, and a second thing that you can do is also use the output, as I said, to estimate the strengths of various causal edges. If you do that, then again, you have a sense in which you can say that you're close to the right answer versus getting the right answer. And in both cases, if you make this assumption, then what it allows is the possibility that you have a kind of uniform consistency in the sense that I can bound the probability of a large error at a fixed sample size. The price you pay for that is that the computational complexity is much, much higher than what we had for instance, in the case of lambda faithfulness. So it's not so clear how useful this would be in practice. And then there's the second question of, is it still too strong? Is it still too likely to be violated? I think you can set it up so that it's less likely to be violated than lambda strong faithfulness, but I don't know, it still may be wildly implausible. And then let me just say something about how you could also use these sort of parametric assumptions, which allow you to use non-conditional independence constraints in constructing your graph. So the idea here is that, let me take a simple case where you have, suppose that you assume that your model is linear, but your error terms are non-Gaussian. So in this case, what we have is, in the Gaussian case, if I regress x on y and I look at the errors, then they're independent of x. But if I regress y on x and I look at the errors, then the errors are independent of y. So I can't use independence in this case to sort of tell me the difference between whether x caused y or y caused x. Jesus. Sorry. That's me. Okay. Sorry. On the other hand, if I have a uniform distribution and I regress x on y, then these are my errors, and my errors, my residuals will be independent of x in one direction. But if these are my residuals in the other direction, and while they're uncorrelated, they are no longer independent. So if I use more information in the distribution than just the conditional independencies, then that's another way in which I can sort of strengthen my results. And as a matter of fact, if I assume that there are no latents and no selection bias, I don't need to assume faithfulness anymore. I can just apply these kinds of techniques. So we've kind of seen that a number of different ways you can try and deal with the unfaithful, which is strengthening the assumptions, weakening the sense of success, using more information from the data than just the conditional independencies. I don't think any of them at this point is completely satisfactory, but I think the basic, some combination of those is sort of the way we're hoping to go and really lessen this dependency on faithfulness that a lot of automated methods have. And I should say that there's an entirely other set of automated search techniques which depend on maximizing a score between the graph and the data. But again, there's at least some kind of faithfulness assumption being built into the idea that the best score is the one that's the true causal model. That still requires some version of faithfulness. So, so that's sort of the stuff that we've been doing, that a variety of people have been doing in terms of trying to fix this faithfulness problem. And I guess another one I could mention is that Carolyn is working on trying to find the sparsest permutation, which is, again, a weaker, that is looking for the ordering of the variables which has the fewest edges but is still Markov to the distribution, and that's definitely weaker than faithfulness as well. Let me just end real quickly. So what do I think are the, so I think the faithfulness, the dependency upon the faithfulness in various search algorithms is one of the major impediments to things working as well as we had hoped. I think the other sort of most important things are it's not so clear what to do with the output of these things when you have thousands or tens of thousands of variables. I mean, you can present a kind of giant hairball to somebody, which is, here's what we think the causal relations are, but nobody kind of knows what to do with that. And moreover, it seems clear that given the fact that a lot of the assumptions are going to be wrong, that a lot of this graph is going to be wrong. And a key difficulty is what techniques could we use to try and locate the parts of the output that we think are more reliable as opposed to the parts which just we don't have that good evidence for. I'll just say there's another project that I work on, which is the fact that there often is a huge amount of background knowledge out there about various biological systems. And there's literally tens of thousands of paper on particular kinds of cancer cell. You'd like to incorporate that data into the model somehow, but no human being can possibly do that. So you would also need a kind of system which can automatically go out, read the journal articles, put that information as kind of background knowledge into an automated system, and then run the automated system. And let me just go to the last one and say, I think feedback, I haven't said anything about feedback in any of this. It introduces a whole set of very difficult problems, and it's not at all clear what the best way to deal with feedback in any of these automated methods is. And typically it's just ignored. So this is my vision of ultimately how this would work. So we'd have automated causal inference, simulations, experiments, automated reading, background knowledge, and somehow we'd put all of this together into one giant system. And I think given the number of variables that we're dealing with and the number of articles that we're dealing with and the number of experiments that we're dealing with, that some kind of automated system that combines all of this together is really going to be essential for progress at a certain point, because it's just going to be beyond any kind of human comprehension what we could do otherwise. All right, I'll stop there then. Thank you.
Questions? Yes, Phoebe.
First of all, I don't think this is a big full graph. Second, so a lot of the success of machine learning has made it basically be quite strong compared to statistics in recent years was to focus on predictions, as you said, right? And there's a way to incorporate prediction of causal effect, right? Which is I don't care to understand the entire system. All I care about is to predict the effect of this, right? So the first example that you gave, of course, we have no idea what's going on.
Right.
But maybe I have some more social effects, and maybe I know I don't want to have an impact on the size of people, but I really just want to have an impact on how much money I give them as an incentive. So does that make our life easier?
And there certainly are people, there has been research, for instance, so in the setup that I've been using, both on score-based and constraint-based, I can't just give you two variables and ask you what the direction of the arrow is. I need to have it interact with other things in order to discover that. On some of the, but if you go beyond sort of the usual scores and the conditional independence tests, there are methods where people sort of can just take pairs of variables and ask what's the direction, what's the causal direction for this pair of variables. Now they're not sort of super successful at it. I mean, they can do way better than chance, but I do think that to the extent that you can sort of just ignore most of what's going on and get answers out would be a huge step forward. And I think there's research in that direction and some progress in that direction, but it means you have to, for instance, be able to ignore various kinds of confounding. I mean, part of the problem here is you don't know even who the measured confounders are. So in that sense, you have a whole bunch of other variables who might be affecting you're only interested in does X cause Y or does Y cause X. But it seems like there's going to be a lot of relevance that in order to determine that, I at least need to know what the confounders are, et cetera. And if you start off not knowing any of that, then it looks like you sort of have to go out and try and figure a lot of that out. Now, another approach is, instead of trying to reconstruct the entire graph, to just try and reconstruct sort of the, basically you can go out, construct a Markov blanket of a variable and go out several steps constructing Markov blankets. So you're constructing a much, much smaller part of the graph, but you're still having to look at sort of a whole slew of things in order to determine who goes into that Markov blanket. So I think that, yeah, I think that would be a very good way to make progress would be, okay, what's the minimum part I'd need in order to get the answers I want and just ignore the rest of it. I don't know how easy it would be to do that.
This is really interesting. So what's your sense about how much progress we can make in places where experiments are not possible because you seem to be relying on, in order to transport something that works in a setting where experiments are possible to a setting where they're not, we have to believe that the universe is no more out to screw us in the places where it's not possible than where they are. And I'm just curious what your hunch is there, because a very pessimistic reading of this talk is, well, we can only actually make causal progress in places where we could go back and check against experiments. I'm a social scientist, so we're just screwed in that universe. I'd like to be optimistic, but I'm not stretching.
Yeah, well, I mean, I mean, in some sense, I can't be, my opinion's in some sense no better than yours. I mean, I'd feel better about applying them to social science where I can't do experiments if I knew they worked somewhere, and particularly if I had, from say the biological context, if I had a good sense of when they didn't work. So that would sort of tell me both the positive and the negative. Now, I mean, of course, you're not going to. I mean, let's put it this way: if it works in biology, that's so much more complicated than I think a lot of the social settings that, I'd feel pretty confident about it, as long as there wasn't something known about the social setting which made it obviously not applicable. I mean, you could say, if I try to apply it to the interactions among people and people know sort of what my theory is, et cetera, then they can react to that. That's not happening in biology, so that would be something to worry about. But I think if we can sort of demonstrate that it works on various biological problems, then let's put it this way. People, have a certain confidence in human beings attempting to do that, to draw these social conclusions, but I think that's largely based on the fact that we have no idea what it is they're doing, and there's no way to test whether they're right? We know that experts are wrong in a whole slew of fields. So, these are things that at least you can do simulations, you can sort of try and get systematic tests in other areas, whereas just asking people to do it by hand is sort of like, that seems to me and to involve more faith than having faith in a technique that at least, was shown, you could prove theorems about that worked in certain contexts, that you had some idea when it would fail.
So let's move the discussion to the reception upstairs, since it's already 5:05. So there's a reception in the 6th floor in this, so the meet tower. So thanks again.
8677.